Thank you very much, and thank you for that generous introduction. I pay my respects to the participants in this dialogue, and I pay my respects to Dr. Jan Beagle, Director General of IDLO, with whom I've had the privilege of working in UN AIDS and in other fields of endeavour relevant to human rights. I'm very glad to have the privilege of making this keynote address, and I wish I could be with you. And soon we will all be together at the end of this terrible time of trial and challenge, including challenges to universal human rights. In the Charter of the United Nations, in the first or second line of the Charter, and in the first line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came 3 years later in 1948, is an elusive word. Lawyers fix on words, and the elusive word is justice. It's this little word justice that exists in these two foundational documents of the United Nations system. I remember a day when I was in my infant school. Forgive me for talking of this personal remembrance, but it does bring home to me the link I have with the very beginnings of the United Nations system and all the mighty developments, successful and less successful, that have followed. In 1944, I was sitting on the footpath outside my infant school, and a great cavalcade went by. And in the lead car of that cavalcade, on its way to open a new hospital for veterans of the Pacific War, was a very great lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And I feel that my eyes locked with Eleanor as she was going by. I was just a little boy of 4 or 5, and she went past, but she had before her the great challenge of completing the task that was not completed at the time of the Charter. Originally, it had been intended to include in the Charter of the United Nations a statement of fundamental human rights, but time ran out. And the result was that a committee was established. Eleanor Roosevelt became the chair of that committee. She worked hard, she banged the heads together, and ultimately there emerged the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a sort of Magna Carta for humanity, and the second part of the essential document, the Charter of the United Nations. And it contained at the beginning this commitment to the little word justice. And finding what that word justice has been both a professional and a personal challenge to me in the years that followed. And I had many privileges in those years, meeting John Humphrey, who was a professor from McGill University in Canada, who had been the person who first put the words on paper that became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And meeting my colleagues and working with them in the judiciary in Australia over a period of 34 years, and working on tasks in the United Nations system over that time. These were the experiences of a lifetime in search of that elusive word justice. And in our time in Australia, I was privileged to serve as chairman of the Law Reform Commission, as well as serving in courts of law as a judge for 34 years. And I can say that one of the proudest things that I learned in my time in Australia was that never was there any corruption of myself or the other judges. We were serving justice in independent and impartial courts. And not to put too fine a point on it, we were rather pleased with ourselves and proud of ourselves, and maybe correctly so, that we were uncorrupted and we decided the cases as they came before us and in accordance with our understanding of the law. And if we disagreed, we could dissent and it would be recorded and the people would judge and ultimately the law might change. But then I attended a conference of lawyers in Hobart, Tasmania. Lawyers have lots of conferences, and this conference was attended by a very great German judge of a different legal system, the civilian legal system. And he started his address. His name was Wolfgang Zeidler. He was a judge of the Verfassungsgerichtshof, the constitutional court of the then West Germany. And he said, in your country, like all the Anglo Saxon countries, you have a marvelous system of justice. You have completely independent judges and a very skillful legal profession. But it's a very expensive form of justice. In fact, it's the Rolls Royce system of justice. In Germany, he said, in Germany, we just have a Volkswagen system of justice. And it's not as perfect as your system of justice. And there was a pause. And he then asked, but how many citizens can afford a Rolls Royce? And how many citizens can afford a Volkswagen? And that question hung in the air as he left the podium. And it is this question that must be addressed by systems of justice everywhere. The very nature of an organized legal system with highly talented and very experienced and lengthily trained lawyers is that they tend to be very accomplished and rather expensive. They expect to be expensive because they've spent all that time studying and getting to be lawyers. And so this is the challenge. What does justice mean? What does the rule of law mean? How do universal human rights operate? And how do they operate in democracies? And that is the puzzle. And it's a puzzle that won't go away. And it's a puzzle to which the forum that has been established by the Human Rights Council is going to address itself when it comes to looking at how to convert the fine language of the resolutions setting up the forum and setting up this dialogue, how to convert those fine ideals into actual delivery of the rule of law and of human rights in democracies, and how we do that is the puzzle. Uh, the actuality is something that cannot exist alongside too much self satisfaction. I've gone to so many glorious sessions in my life where the lawyers dress up, and rightly so, and celebrate their achievements. But lurking in the back of my mind has been Dr. Wolfgang Zeidler's question: how many can afford the system, and what can we do to make the system more accessible? And that is the question that IDLO has addressed itself to, and I applaud the questions it has set for us and is addressing to the discussions that will lead up to the meeting of the forum. How to empower the independent legal decision making as it merges out of the period of COVID 19 and as the special procedures that have been introduced in our nation states to deal with the pandemic, the lockdowns, and the compulsion. How do we ensure that we achieve justice and what is the obligation of lawyers, but also of non lawyers and of democratic legislatures and of young people in ensuring justice as we move out of COVID and into the world as it was, but changed by our experience over the last year and more. How do we invest in legal aid? And are there different forms of legal aid that can encourage more people to get to justice so that it isn't beyond the pocket of ordinary citizens and so that real justice can be accomplished by ordinary folk? How do we ensure that vulnerable people, amongst the vulnerable groups in our society, can have access to justice? Especially, how do we ensure that women and girls can find their voice in the challenges of justice? This is a major issue in the world today. Also, a major issue is how racial minorities can find their voice in the struggle for justice, and how Indigenous people can have their voice heard, how LGBTIQ people, sexual minorities, of whom I am a member, can have their voice heard, how all of these specially vulnerable groups can know the word justice, can know that it's there in the Charter and it's there on the first line of the Universal Declaration. How can they have access to justice and how can that be made affordable? How can we use alternative dispute resolution, with which professionally I have had some experience since leaving the court system, and how we can use informal systems of justice consistently with United Nations principles to bring justice in an affordable way to the people who have problems so that the rule of law is not just a theory but is an actuality. And how can we rebuild the multilateralism that was such a valuable part of the activities of the international community in the years following the Charter and the Universal Declaration and all the great treaties of the United Nations and the great institutions of the United Nations that have followed? So these are the commitments that IDLO has laid before us in this dialogue, and they are practical commitments, and they come to me from a lifetime, really, 34 years as a judge in Australia, and as has been said, many activities for the United Nations since. One lesson I learned in all of those activities was the importance of a highly accomplished legal profession, well trained and not corrupted, dedicated to deciding matters according to law. But equally important was to open our ears to the voices of people who need to be heard if we are to understand what the rule of law means in practice. In my days in Australia, I worked in the Law Reform Commission, and we always had public hearings to hear the voices. In my days in the United Nations, in the work on the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, we did our job in a slightly different way. We had public hearings. We listened to the voices. Listening only to ourselves is a way that can lead to error. Listening to the voices of those who are affected, including the vulnerable, including the marginalized, is what Jan Beagle and I learned in our work together on HIV/AIDS in UNAIDS and before UNAIDS. And it's what IDLO is now doing in its important work for law and development of human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and justice.